Hello, welcome to our basic biochemistry lecture. Today we're going to be covering a lot of ground. We'll be starting out talking about atoms. So it's kind of divided into three sections. Just talking about atoms and what they are, talking about chemical bonds, and then talking about water. Like I said, it will be a pretty long and also vigorous lecture. So one thing you could do is kind of treat it as three different lectures and pause after each section and think about the material. All right, so we're going to start out by talking about atoms, and that's because they're the basic building block of everything. Okay, we talked earlier about how biological life forms are organized starting at a very low level. So at the chemical level, everything starts out as atoms, and then the atoms are organized into molecules. Molecules are organized into cells. Cells are organized into tissues, and so on up to an entire organism. Not only are living organisms made of atoms, but everything is too. So the computer that you're looking at, the chair you're sitting on, everything is composed of atoms. So first of all, we better learn what atoms are. So it's the smallest unit of an element. An element is matter that cannot be subdivided into anything else. Okay, elements or atoms are composed of three components. There's the proton and the protons and the neutrons. The protons and the neutrons reside in what's called the nucleus. Okay, and then the electrons are out here orbiting around the nucleus. It's a little bit confusing that we just talked about cells having a nucleus, and now we're talking about atoms having a nucleus. They're different, but they come from the same root word that means center of something. Okay, and the protons and neutrons are found in the center, and then the electrons are found orbiting around. All right, this is a periodic table of the elements. It shows all of the elements. And luckily for us, we're not going to be looking at all of these. Biological chemistry is quite different than regular chemistry or inorganic chemistry, where you learn about all of the different elements. We're just going to focus on a couple. So first of all, the periodic table of the elements actually has some information in it that's important. Okay. First of all, you notice that there are squares. Each square indicates a different type of element. Okay, so, and it has its abbreviation. Okay, so for example, this one is hydrogen. Okay, and it also shows this number here. Okay, and that's telling us the number of protons, which usually also equals the number of electrons. And as we'll see going forward in this lecture, what we're really concerned about for the chemistry that we're going to use is how many electrons are there. And so that tells you there. Okay. Lucky for us, like I said, we're not going to be looking at all these different types of elements. We're really only going to be picking on a few: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. There are some others that we'll see, like phosphorus and sulfur. But those are the basic ones. Okay. Most of an organism is made out of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So those are the ones that we're going to be working with and the ones that we care about. Okay. You guys do need to memorize their code and the number of electrons that they have. Okay, so let's think about the electrons. So there are the protons. Protons have a positive charge, and so I put them as a plus. Electrons have a negative charge, and so they have a little minus for their symbol. Okay. Electrons are found in electron shells, also sometimes called orbitals. These are also, you could think of these as energy levels. So going out from the nucleus, you find the electrons in these energy kind of levels. Okay, and the further away from the nucleus an electron is, the more energetic it is, so the more energy it has. Okay, there's one first electron shell, and then a second electron shell, and a third electron shell. And there's more than this because some elements have many, many electrons. For our purposes, we won't look at anything that goes above the third electron shell. Electron shell can carry a certain number of electrons. Okay, the first electron shell can carry up to 2 electrons. If it has more than 2 electrons, if the atom has more than 2 electrons, they cannot go into that first electron shell. They have to go up to the next shell. The second electron shell can carry up to 8 electrons, as can the third electron. Okay? And these electrons are distributed in a specific way in the electron shell. Okay? So the first 2 are here in the first shell. Okay? If the atom has more than 2, they'll go up into the next shell, okay, where there are the 8. And then if it has even more, it'll go up even higher. Okay? So electron shells sometimes are full and sometimes are not full. They always get filled from the inside out. Okay? The outermost shell is called the valence shell, and this is when it is full. When the outermost shell is full, then you have an unreactive atom. Most things are not unreactive, only the noble gases are unreactive. Most things don't have full valence shells. Okay, oops. Get rid of that. So let's look at carbon, for example. Okay, so here's carbon. It has 6 electrons. The first 2 go into the first electron shell, and the next 4 go into the second electron shell. Okay, and because it doesn't have a full electron shell, it is considered to be reactive. Okay, these electrons are not satisfied. They want to find a partner, and the valence shell needs to be full. All right, what we're going to do is look at each of those 4 elements. We're going to look at hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen, and draw an electron shell diagram for each of these. Okay, so let me get my pen out here. Go away. No. Sorry, it took so long. Okay, so first let's look at hydrogen. That has an H, that's what stands for hydrogen, and it has 1 electron. Okay, so the electron shell diagram, I'm not going to draw the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus. I'm still instead going to draw a circle. Okay, that represents the nucleus, and the H tells me that we're talking about hydrogen. Okay, hydrogen just has 1 electron, so that means it's just going to have 1 electron shell, and it's going to have that little hydrogen in it, right? Remember that the second electron shell can hold up to 2 electrons, okay? But it only has 1, so that means that 1 electron is missing. Oh, by the way, E with a little minus sign equals an electron. Okay, so I'll be using that. Okay, so hydrogen is missing 1 electron in order to have a full valence shell. And if it had 2 electrons, then it wouldn't be hydrogen anymore. It would be helium, and it would be unreactive. Okay. Next, we'll look at carbon. Okay. Carbon has 6 electrons total. Okay. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to represent the nucleus with a C with a circle in it. Okay. Indeed, there would be 6 protons and 6 neutrons in there, but we're not going to draw them out. Okay. Okay. In its first shell, we'll go 2 of those electrons. Okay. And now it still has 4 more, so those have to go into the second shell, because remember that first shell can only hold 2 electrons. Okay, and we don't just draw them all higgledy-piggledy. We're going to draw them in a specific way. We're going to start out at the top and go around clockwise to distribute them one at a time. This helps us remember when we go a little bit further how many covalent bonds can be made. Okay, so 1 electron, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so this guy has 6 total, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and in his valence shell, remember that's this outer shell, it has only 4 electrons. That valence shell can hold up to 8 electrons. Okay, so that means it's missing an electron here, and here, and here, and here in order to have a full valence shell. So it is missing 4 electrons. And I say missing in quotes because it wouldn't be carbon if it had those 4 electrons, but it's looking for 4 electrons in order to be satisfied. All right, now let's look at nitrogen. Nitrogen has 7 electrons, and remember I'm getting this from that from the table of the elements. Okay, do the same thing, nitrogen. Okay, and nitrogen is going to have its first 2 electrons in its first electron shell. Okay, but it still has 5 more. Okay, and we're going to do this in the same way. We're not going to just throw them in there. We're going to distribute them around in a circle, one at a time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and it has 5, so it's going to have one there. Okay, and that means it could have another electron here, here, or here. That second shell can still hold 8, so now it's missing 3 electrons. Okay, finally let's look at oxygen. Oxygen has 8 electrons. Okay, so there's oxygen, there's the nucleus. Okay. 2 electrons are going to go into the first electron shell, and then the other 6 are going to go into the outermost shell, the valence shell, which in this case is the second electron shell. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and then we can see very readily here that we're missing an electron here and here, right? So here we're missing 2 electrons. Okay. These are important. You guys need to memorize these electron shell diagrams and definitely be able to draw them from memory. They're important because the electrons, the distribution of the electrons, indicate how that atom then reacts with other atoms around it. Okay, so here's a diagram that shows all of the electron shell diagrams. So you can have that for reference. Okay, and now we're going to move in and talk about types of chemical bonds. Okay, so there are 3 types of chemical bonds. Okay, and chemical bonds are how atoms interact to form compounds, molecules, and then the complex biochemistry that we see in cells that allows cells to do what they do is all about chemical bonds. Okay, so this information really forms the foundation of what you need to know to understand many things going forward in this class. Okay, I know it's a biology class, but their biology is essentially chemistry. Okay, it's just biochemistry. So we have to understand this basic stuff if we want to get a handle on the more complex stuff. And so if this is a little confusing for you, haven't had it before, then what you really need to do is spend some extra time on it. Okay? All right, chemical bonds. So these form between atoms with unfilled valence shells. Okay, there are 3 types. There are ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. Okay, and these chemical reactions occur to create chemical bonds. Okay, or chemical reactions occur to create chemical bonds, excuse me. So if you're talking about something having a chemical reaction, it's going to create some kind of bond. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these in order. Ionic bonds, wait, wow, I didn't know it would automatically do that. Sorry, that's okay. So ionic bonds are a strong attraction between an anion and a cation. Okay. An ion is just a charged particle. It could be either a single atom or a molecule. And anion means one that has a negative charge on it. Okay, so an anion is a negative charge. And here are some examples. So we'll see hydroxyl ions, or OH groups, and chlorine ions, for example. And a cation is positively charged. So hydrogen ions or protons, because it just has a proton, and sodium are examples. Okay, and the thing about ionic bonds that you need to know is it's just this attraction between a positive and a negative, and it creates what's called an ionic compound. Okay, here's an example of the formation of sodium chloride, which is table salt, so it's something that we're all familiar with. Okay, what happens when you form an ionic bond is first you have to have ionization. Okay, ionization occurs when an atom either has a very weak attraction to one of its electrons or a very super strong attraction to somebody else's electron. Okay, so in the case of sodium chloride, here we have sodium. Okay, sodium has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 electrons. Okay, and that means it just has this one out here hanging out on its own. Nobody else in that shell. That means that sodium doesn't really have a very strong attraction for that electron. If it could just get rid of it, then it would have only 10 electrons, and it would be much more stable, right? Because it would have a full valence shell. Okay. Of course, then once it gets rid of this, it's going to have one extra proton, because remember it has 11 protons in here. So if it has 11 protons, So 11 protons with a plus charge, and then if it loses that electron, it will have only 10 electrons. It's going to have a balance of 1 proton. Okay, so this takes on a positive charge, which is what we see here. Okay, and then chlorine has the opposite. So it has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Wait, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. It has 17 electrons, okay? And it's just missing 1 electron here. So if only it could get 1 electron from somebody, it would be stable because then it would have a full valence shell, okay? So it can get that electron from sodium, and now it will have 18 electrons, but of course it still has 17 protons, okay? And then it has 1 more electron than protons, so it's going to take on a negative charge. Okay, so here, these are our ions. Okay, that's the process of ionization, is one atom or one molecule giving up an electron to somebody else or getting electrons from somebody else. Okay, once ionization happens, then you have a cation and an anion, and they're really attracted to each other. Okay, so that's just a basic law of the world, is that positives and negatives attract, or you could think of it as opposites attract. Right, and that forms an ionic bond. Next are covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are what we see most of in biology, and so we'll spend more time talking about these. Okay, we see some covalent bonds, so you need to know what they are. And the idea of ionization. But covalent bonds form when any 2 atoms with unfilled valence shells share electrons. Okay, so remember all of those atoms that are missing electrons from their valence shells, they're very unstable. Okay, and when they are unstable, that means they are looking for a buddy. They're looking for someone to get electrons from. And one of the ways they can do that is to share electrons. And the important thing here is that these shared electrons count towards the valence shell electrons for both atoms. And when we form covalent bonds, we create molecules. Okay, so here's a very straightforward example. We have 2 hydrogen atoms. Remember, they each have 1 electron, and each one of them would like to have another electron, right? So this guy would want one here, and this guy wants one here, because that outer shell can hold up to 2 electrons. When it holds 2 electrons, then it's full. Right? So one thing they can do to each become stable and non-reactive is to each share an electron with each other. And that's what's showing here. Okay? These are the 2 shared electrons. Right? So when we show, these are electron shell diagrams, as is this. Okay? When we show a covalent bond forming, we show the electron shells overlapping, and then these electrons then are going to be buddies. Okay, so electrons really like to be with somebody else. When they're by themselves, they're not happy. They want to have a buddy, and so they're constantly looking for one. Unpaired electrons are highly reactive. So if you have ever heard of what free radicals are, free radicals form as a byproduct of some of our metabolism, and they can be very dangerous because there's just an electron by itself zipping around. It can zip into your DNA and cause problems. And one thing you can do is consume antioxidants because they absorb those free radicals, those electrons. But in any case, so these guys, these electrons now are happy because they each have a buddy, okay? And they're going to go around as a pair, and they're going to orbit around the nucleus of this atom and the nucleus of this atom. Well, that wasn't a very good circle. You know what I mean, okay? So they're going to spend all their time going around both of these, and they're going to do that together, okay? Now each hydrogen thinks that it has 2 electrons, okay? And that's the covalent bond has formed there, okay? So another way to write this would be to say a hydrogen plus a hydrogen. Okay, this thing here means that we have a chemical reaction. Okay, and I always abbreviate reaction RXN. Okay, and then this shows right here, that little arrow, or that little line there shows a covalent bond. Okay, and it is representing these 2 electrons, right? These 2 electrons are what's being shared between them. Okay. Okay, these are what we call a single covalent bond. Okay, a single covalent bond forms when any 2 atoms share 1 electron each. But we also have double bonds. Oops, I skipped right over a slide. I'll get to that in a second. Okay, Here is some basic information that you need to know. So every unshared electron in a valence shell can make one covalent bond. Okay, so the most simple example we just showed with two hydrogens just makes a single covalent bond. But here is a more complex example, building on that understanding. Okay, here we're going to be building water, which is a molecule that has 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. Okay, oxygen, remember, has 8 electrons total, but it has 6 in its valence shell, and it can hold up to 8 in that valence shell, right? So it's missing 1 here and it's missing 1 here. And hydrogen, we already said, has 1 in its valence shell, and it can hold up to 2. So he wants 1 there, and this one wants 1 there. Okay. So we would write this out also: 2H plus O. Okay, and then this is missing the arrow. Okay. And what would happen is there's really only one way to bring hydrogen and hydrogen together, and that is for each hydrogen to make a single covalent bond with the oxygen. Okay, and remember, these electrons then are going to be orbiting around the nucleus of both atoms. Okay, and same with these ones. Boy, I'm really bad at drawing those circles, aren't I? So the point here is that now these hydrogens feel that they have their valence shells full, and so does this oxygen, because now it has 2, 4, 6, 8, if it counts those shared ones. Okay, and then we get a molecule of water, right? And this line and this line represent these covalent bonds where there are 2 electrons shared. Okay, so a single covalent bond is when 2 atoms each share 1 electron. So these are both covalent bonds, single covalent bonds, because this guy shared 1 electron and this guy shared 1 electron, and this one and this one. Okay, and now we also have something called double covalent bonds, and that's when 2 atoms each share 2 electrons. Okay, double covalent bonds really just equal 2 single covalent bonds between the same 2 atoms. They're not anything like mysterious or anything. Okay, so say, for example, we have 2 oxygen atoms, and this is drawn a little bit differently than we have drawn it. But that's okay. And there's a carbon. Okay, so if we want to put 2 oxygens with a carbon, the only way we can do it is to make carbon share 2 atoms, or excuse me, 2 electrons with the oxygen on one side, and 2 electrons with the oxygen on the other side. Okay, so and then these can get tricky to draw, so I'm going to go ahead and draw it out just to show you the process of drawing it. Okay, so usually what I do is I just draw the outer valence shell. Okay, and I'm going to draw their overlapping valence shells to start with. Okay, oxygen and oxygen. Okay, so this oxygen has other electrons over here that aren't involved. Okay, and then its 2 electrons that are looking for buddies are going to be here. Okay, so those are the electrons that oxygen brings to the table, which is 6. Okay, and then this one's going to be the same over here. Okay, and he's going to share them here. I'm going to switch color to show the carbon, if I can. Show it in red. Okay, so I'm going to show the carbon's electrons in red. So the carbon has 4 electrons, so it's going to show it here. Okay, and so now these are double bonds. Okay, and I don't think I have it on my slide to show you what it looks like. Okay, so you could write this out as 2 oxygen plus 1 carbon is going to equal C. Okay, and that these are equivalent things, right? So this is showing that carbon is sharing 2 electrons, and you could even write in the electrons there. Okay, here's carbon's electrons that it's going to share. And then here are oxygens that it's sharing. All right, here next is a little self-check, okay? We're going to see if we can draw out this molecule called C2H4, okay? So the first thing you would do if you were thinking about this is to think about what the electron shell diagram for each of the atoms looks like, Okay, these carbon atoms are drawn slightly different. They didn't separate out the electrons, but the same number is there. Okay, so we have 2 of those carbons that look like that and 4 hydrogens. Okay, and just looking at that, you know that each hydrogen has to make a single covalent bond. Certainly the hydrogens can't make a double covalent bond because they don't have 2 electrons to share. Okay, and the only way to make this happen is to make each hydrogen make a covalent bond with carbon. Okay, and here that is shown here. Okay, so and the carbons have to make a double bond, and the hydrogens each have to make a single bond with a carbon. Okay, and that's the only way to make it work without having some electrons left over. So when you're drawing a molecule, you always have to have all of the electrons accounted for. You can't leave any hanging off. Okay, so if we tried to do a carbon-carbon single bond here, it just wouldn't work out properly. All right, so now we've covered what covalent bonds are and how they form. Okay, so remember, covalent bonds are sharing of electrons in order for each atom that's in there to have a full valence shell. Atoms will make as many covalent bonds as they need to in order to have a valence shell. So even if you have an atom that's bonded to other atoms with covalent bonds, if it's missing a covalent bond, meaning that it still has an unshared electron, it will still be reactive. Okay, like so if we took off one of these hydrogens, then we would then have carbon with an electron hanging out there wanting to react. Okay, and now we're going to talk about the 2 types of covalent bonds. Okay, so I know this is a lot of information. I really recommend writing out an outline of the different things that we're talking about here as you're going through the lecture. Okay, so there are 2 types of covalent bonds. There are ones that are called nonpolar bonds and ones that are called polar bonds. Okay, we'll first address the nonpolar bonds, and they're a little related to each other, so sometimes it can be hard to understand what one is without the other, so hold tight. Okay, so nonpolar covalent bonds, this means that the electrons that are in the bond, in other words, the shared electrons, are shared equally between the atoms. Okay, so here is an example of this. So if you have a carbon-carbon bond, and another way to write this would be a CC bond, right? And that's the those are those 2 electrons. Or you could draw that with their electron shells overlapped. Let's see if I can do that up here. Okay. Okay, drawing just the outer shell. A single bond would mean that each would bring one electron into the bond or into that relationship. Each carbon in this case would still have other electrons that would have to make other bonds, right? So each with maybe 3 hydrogens, that could be, or more carbons or whatever. Okay, but the point here is these shared electrons, so these ones that are in the bond here, okay, remember they are orbiting around the nucleus of each carbon, and they do that together. Okay, so they spend some time going around this nucleus, and then they spend some time going around this nucleus. Okay, when you have a nonpolar bond, those electrons are shared equally between these 2 guys. Okay, so that means they spend approximately 50% of their time over here and 50% of their time over here. One analogy that I like to think of with a nonpolar bond is these are 2 kids out on the playground who are the same size and are each pulling on the end of a rope doing tug of war, but because they are the same size and the same amount of strength, they aren't overwhelming each other. Or maybe 2 kids sharing nicely on the playground playing with a ball. In contrast, we have the polar covalent bonds, and this is the opposite. So this is when the electrons in the bond, or also you could call them the shared electrons, are shared unequally. Okay, so remember the same thing. We're talking about electrons that are in the bond, and if they're shared unequally, they're spending unequal amounts of time. Okay, so another way to write this would be OH, right? And then you could also look at the electron shell diagram for this. Okay, hydrogen's going to bring its 1 electron in, and oxygen will bring 1. It is still going to have another one that wants to make another bond here, right? But we're just talking about these guys. They are going to still act like a pair and spend time orbiting around the oxygen and then orbiting around the hydrogen. Okay, But because this is a polar bond, they're going to spend more time around one of the atoms than the other. Okay, in that case, this is oxygen. And that the gray cloud here is supposed to be showing you how much time is spent around each of the atoms. So if you notice, oops, oh yeah, sorry about that. If you notice here, the gray is the same size, right? Because they're shared equally. Here, hydrogen has just a little bit of gray, whereas oxygen has a lot, and that means that the electrons are spending more time around the oxygen. Okay, so if you could track them, they would, spend more time just zipping around the oxygen, and then maybe once in a while go over to the hydrogen. Zip, zip, zip around the oxygen, little bit of time over the hydrogen. Okay, so they spend more time over here around the oxygen than around the hydrogen, so they're not sharing equally. Okay, oxygen you could think of as kind of like the big giant kid on the playground. Hydrogen is the smallest kid in the class, and they're trying to do tug of war. Okay, oxygen is going to win, or the big guys get a win because so much stronger. Okay, or you could think of this as two kids who are not playing well on the playground. One of them, the oxygen, is the bully and is stealing the ball, whereas the hydrogen is not. Okay, so the upshot of this is really important. Okay, because those electrons, remember these electrons have a negative charge on them, right? So like two little negative things zipping around. Okay, oxygen, if they spend equal amounts of time, then the charges are going to balance out. But if they spend more time around one of the atoms than the other, then that atom is going to become what's called partially negatively charged. Okay, and we represent this by a delta minus. You could draw it like this. Okay, so a delta minus means a partial negative charge. Okay, and that's because the electrons spend more time around the oxygen. And the opposite is true for the other guy. Okay, so the one who hogs the electrons becomes negatively charged, partially negatively charged, and the one that becomes that it's getting taken away from becomes partially positively charged. Okay, this is different than ionization. Why? Because the electron is not being stolen completely from hydrogen and given to oxygen. It's just being partially stolen, and so you just get this partial charge. Okay. This is really important when we go forward, but first let's talk about how do we know whether or not we're dealing with a polar or non-polar bond. This is a really important point. You're going to need to be able to predict these, and it's all based on something called electronegativity. Okay. Electronegativity is simply a measure of an atom's ability to attract electrons. Okay. Higher electronegativity means a stronger attraction to electrons. So you could think of it as like more electron greedy, whereas the opposite, a lower electronegativity, means a weaker attraction for electrons. Okay. All right, so we just need to know relative scale of electronegativity for our purposes in this class of figuring out whether or not you're looking at a polar or non-polar bond. There are actual numbers associated with these. You can look them up, but you don't need to know that. You just need to know the relative scale, as in who is more electronegative than who, when we're dealing with those four different atoms. Okay, so we're going to make a scale going from low electronegativity to high electronegativity. Okay, and remember, low electronegativity means a weaker attraction for electrons, whereas a high electronegativity means a stronger attraction to electrons. Okay, down here at the low end, we have both hydrogen and carbon. And although their values are not exactly equal, for our purposes in biology, they are more or less the same. So we count them as having equally low electronegativity. Okay, right there in the middle is nitrogen. And then down here on the high electronegativity end is oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is always the bully. Oxygen out of these four is always going to have the highest electronegativity, and hydrogen and carbon are going to be the weakest kids in the class. They don't have very strong electronegativity at all, and then nitrogen's right there in the middle. Okay, another way to write this would be this. So carbon and hydrogen have equal, and then nitrogen is higher and oxygen is higher. Okay, you need to memorize something. It's really handy if on a test you can draw either this part out or this part. Okay, and then you have it to refer to because you'll need it in order to predict whether or not you're dealing with polar or non-polar bonds. And why that's important is I'm going to tell you in a few minutes. All right, so here are some examples of nonpolar bonds, okay? Anything that is bonded to itself, and remember here these are single bonds, so there's 2 electrons being shared, one from carbon and one from hydrogen. They're going to go around the nucleus of each atom equally, okay, because of nonpolar bonds. They are nonpolar because carbon and carbon have equal electronegativity to each other. I'm not going to write that out. So anything that's bonded to itself is going to be a nonpolar bond. Okay, so carbon-carbon bond, hydrogen-hydrogen bond, even oxygen-oxygen bond, because oxygen has equal electronegativity to oxygen, is going to be a nonpolar bond. Nitrogen-nitrogen. And then we have this one. We actually see a lot of these carbon-hydrogen bonds in biological molecules. Okay, remember that from our previous slide, that carbon and hydrogen have equal electronegativity. Okay, if they have equal electronegativity, then they are going to be a nonpolar bond. Okay, so equal electronegativity means that they share electrons equally and they form a nonpolar bond. Okay, polar bonds are the opposite. It's when one atom has higher electronegativity than another. Okay, so remember, and this is where it's really helpful to be able to just jot this down to remind yourself, right? So has the highest electronegativity? Oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is going to be hogging electrons. It's always going to, whenever it's dealing with any of these other 3 atoms, it is going to take on a partial negative charge because it's so much more electronegative. And hydrogen will do the opposite, as will carbon and nitrogen when they're dealing with each other, with an oxygen. Okay, so these are polar bonds, and you could draw the electrons to reflect that. They're going to spend most of their time over there by oxygen. Okay, what about this one, nitrogen-hydrogen? Well, nitrogen has a higher electronegativity than hydrogen does. So in this case, nitrogen is the bully, and hydrogen is still not the bully. And those electrons are going to spend over here. And same here, because carbon and hydrogen have the same electronegativity, nitrogen is going to have a higher electronegativity, and so it's going to steal those electrons for part of the time, leaving that carbon with a positive charge. Okay, you guys need to be able to predict whether or not you're dealing with a polar or a nonpolar bond, and that's all based on that scale of electronegativity. Okay, this becomes very important because of the 3rd type of bond, which are called hydrogen bonds. So just a quick review, we talked about ionic bonds, we've talked about covalent bonds, and covalent bonds have are either polar or nonpolar. Okay, and now we're going to talk about hydrogen bonds, and hydrogen bonds are related to polar covalent bonds. Okay, so often people think that when we're talking about hydrogen bonds, we must be talking about a hydrogen-hydrogen covalent bond, and this is not the case. Okay, so you want to get that idea out of your head. What we're really dealing with here is an attraction between partial charges. Okay, they're called hydrogen bonds because they often involve a hydrogen, because hydrogen's so it has such low electronegativity that when it's sharing with an oxygen, then you have a polar bond. Okay, but really it's just an attraction between any partial negative and any partial positive. Can be between partial charges on different molecules, or between partial charges on different parts of large molecules. Okay. So, water is often involved in polar bonds, in hydrogen bonds, because it's so polar. Okay, so this is a water molecule. Remember, water is H2O, okay, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. These are each single covalent bonds, right? So you could think about the electrons. This is called a Lewis dot structure when you don't actually draw out the electron shell diagram, just draw in the electrons. Go away. Go away. So he's giving 1, and he's giving 1, and he's giving 1, and he's giving 1. The hydrogen has lower electronegativity than does the oxygen. So the oxygen is actually going to be stealing electrons from this hydrogen, and that hydrogen becoming partially negatively charged and partially positively charged. Okay. We call a molecule that has all polar bonds, or a good number of polar bonds, we call it a polar molecule. Okay, and we call a molecule that has few or no polar bonds, we call it a nonpolar molecule. Okay? When you get water, which is very polar, next to other water molecules, then you have an attraction between the partial negative on one of the waters and a partial positive on the other, and that forms a hydrogen bond. Okay? That's what is represented here. Okay? That's the hydrogen bond. I often abbreviate hydrogen bond as an H bond. Okay, and that's what that's representing there. We always represent hydrogen bonds with a dotted line, a dashed line, to differentiate between a covalent bond. Okay, hydrogen bonds are really very weak. Okay, it's this transient attraction between a partial negative and a partial positive. As these molecules move around, they will get too far away from each other to make that bond, and it'll fall apart. So they're weak, and they're also transient. That means that they move around a lot. However, in there. However, they are ubiquitous. They're all over inside cells. Okay, and that makes them really important in biology. Okay, so having an understanding of what a hydrogen bond is going to help you understand how bigger molecules that we're going to talk about interact with each other and with water, and that's because water is everywhere inside cells. Okay, so this water molecule here will be around other water molecules and can form hydrogen bonds anytime a partial positive and a partial negative get around each other. Okay, and that's what this is showing here too. They've drawn the partial thing as an 8 rather than a like that, but that's okay. Still means the same thing. So here's the partial negative, and it's being attracted to the partial positive. Here's partial positive being attracted to a partial negative. Okay, notice that you always have the partial negative being attracted to a partial positive. You never have a partial positive attracted to another partial positive, or a partial negative attracted to another partial negative. Okay, water's pretty cool because water's everywhere, obviously in our environment, but also inside cells. And whenever it gets around other water molecules, it just automatically forms all these polar bonds. Okay, and you get this whole matrix of, automatically forms all these hydrogen bonds. And you get this matrix showing all of these hydrogen bonds. Okay, so here's a whole bunch of water molecules. Like every water molecule is going to have one red oxygen and two white hydrogens. Okay, and then it's going to be hydrogen bonded to other water molecules. Okay, and so that means through these hydrogen bonds with the water molecules, all the water molecules are attached to each other. A good way to think about this is if you had a room full of people and they're all milling around, but you ask them to hold hands and not let go. If you pull one person out the door, it's going to cause that person who's holding hands with another person to be pulled out of the door as well, and so on until you pull everybody out. Okay, so that's a good way to think about hydrogen bonds. Okay. So definitely water molecules can form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. They can also form hydrogen bonds between any molecules. Okay, this molecule here, so these guys are water. Okay, so we have all of these water molecules here. If you put this other molecule in water, there would be even more, but just showing some. Okay, this other molecule is called glucose. Okay, you're going to get to know glucose very well, so you'll become very familiar with this. Glucose has carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens, and that's it. And lots of single covalent bonds. So remember, each line is going to represent a single covalent bond. This molecule is way too big to draw an electron shell diagram for. That would just be horrible to have to do. And so we just have those lines instead. Okay, but if you look at it, you can see that there are both polar bonds and nonpolar bonds. Okay, so let's just point out some of the polar bonds. Okay, remember, oxygen is the most electronegative, right? And we just are dealing with oxygen and hydrogen and carbon. So every time we see an oxygen, it's going to be bonded to either a carbon or a hydrogen, and that means you're going to be dealing with polar bonds. Okay, so this is a polar bond, and this is a polar bond. This is a polar bond, and this is this big long one, and this 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 one. Okay, maybe draw it this way. We would call this molecule, glucose, definitely a polar molecule. It definitely has some nonpolar molecule, bonds in it, but it has so many polar bonds that we call the whole thing polar, okay? But also has some nonpolar bonds. So remember, carbon and hydrogen have equal electronegativity. So anytime you have a carbon-hydrogen bond, it's going to be nonpolar. And every time you have a carbon-carbon bond, that's going to be nonpolar too. Okay, so all these other ones are nonpolar. So you should be able to, and we're going to practice this in class, but you should be able to go through a molecule like this and point out where the polar bonds are and where the nonpolar bonds are. Okay, but let's talk about the hydrogen bonds. So glucose can make hydrogen bonds with water because it has all of these polar bonds. Okay, anytime it has a polar bond, it's going to do that partial positive and partial negative thing. Okay, and that will allow it to interact with water to form hydrogen bonds. Okay, we'll just look at a couple of these. So here is a polar bond. That means this oxygen has a partial negative and this hydrogen has a partial positive. Here comes water with its partial negative. It's going to be attracted to that partial positive and we're going to form a hydrogen bond. Okay, same thing here, except for the opposite. Okay, here is an oxygen with its partial negative. It's going to attract the other end of the water molecule with its partial positive and form a hydrogen bond there. Okay, so you could go around to all of these and look at them. Okay, another thing is that polar bonds. Oh, it should say hydrogen bonds, does it? Okay, good. Phew. This should say hydrogen bonds. Sorry about that. So hydrogen bonds can also form between water and charged substances. So a charged substance just has a full charge on it, but it will still attract the oppositely charged partial part of water, the partially charged part of water. So potassium has a positive charge on it. It's an ion. So this is an ion, the K plus. Okay, and it's going to attract the partial negative, and they'll form hydrogen bonds all the way around it. Okay. So polar bonds can form between polar molecules and between ions, but they cannot form between nonpolar molecules. Okay, so we can't get water coming in and making hydrogen bonds with either of these nonpolar molecules. Why? Because there's no polar bonds, right? So if there are no polar bonds, then there are no partial charges. So this hydrogen and this carbon have equal electronegativity, so there's not going to be a partial positive or a partial negative. Same here, right? So there's no partial negative and partial positive to attract each other. So we can't get any hydrogen bonds forming between here. And likewise, we can't get a nonpolar molecule to form a hydrogen bond with water when there's no partial charges on it, right? So here's water with its partial positive and its partial negative, but it has no partial charges on this molecule to look for, okay? And notice that these are, you know, fully made out of just carbon and hydrogen, and again, of course, carbon and hydrogen have equal electronegativity. Okay, a good understanding of hydrogen bonds helps us understand water, and that takes us to the last part of our lecture for today. It's all about water. Okay, water is essential for life, and it forms most of the volume of our cells. So we are mostly water, and we don't understand how life can exist without water, so it's essential for life as we know it. All biochemistry that we talk about inside cells takes place inside aqueous environment. So water is always present, and so you always have to be thinking about it. Okay. Water has 4 unique characteristics, and all result from the ability to make hydrogen bonds. Okay, so either hydrogen bonds between other water molecules, or hydrogen bonds that form between water and other polar or charged substances, like we were just talking about a few minutes ago. Okay. We're going to briefly go through each one of these characteristics. Okay, so first of all, something called cohesion, and this is just the idea that water molecules stick to each other, right? So that's shown here. Every water molecule is going to be making hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, or you could think of it as holding hands. And this causes water to behave a little differently than other substances that don't make hydrogen bonds. Okay, and it's really useful for some things like trees. So trees, in order to stay alive, need to pull water up from their roots. Okay, so and then they put their leaves that are doing photosynthesis way up here in the air. Okay, and they need to pull water up from the roots from the soil up into the leaves. And the way they do that is they rely on this cohesiveness of water. Okay, water gets pulled up through the leaves and out through these tiny little holes in the leaves called stomata. Okay, they're these little tubes inside of the stem or the trunk of a tree that fit water molecules in it. As one water molecule leaves through that little hole, that's called evaporation or transpiration, it is holding hands or hydrogen bonded to another water molecule. Okay, and then that's hydrogen bonded to another one and another one, another one, all the way down the line. And so it's kind of like a little train of water molecules that are pulled up, or it's like that. It's like a bunch of people inside of a room who are holding hands, and you pull one out and you pull them all out. Okay. It also allows, this cohesiveness allows some organisms to balance on top of the water. They have to be light and be able to spread out their weight. But the hydrogen bonds make it a little bit harder to break through the surface. So if you're light and spread out your weight, you can press down on that and not quite break those hydrogen bonds. It makes that little dent. This makes water behave like it has a thin film of plastic on top of it. Of course, heavy organisms like ourselves would break right through. But these, you can see these little dents in the water, and that's this part here, where the weight of the organism is pushing down, yet not breaking through. This is a water spider, by the way, and this is a water strider. This is an insect, that's a spider. They both live by skating around the surface of water and attacking other insects. Okay, the second characteristic is being a good solvent, and this means, so being a good solvent means that it can dissolve many things. Okay, water can dissolve polar and ionic substances. Okay, dissolving really just means making hydrogen bonds with something. Okay, so remember that sodium, for example, is an ion. Okay, when you take some table salt and stick it in water, it dissolves, right? Or when you put some sugar in water, it dissolves. And that's because water is making hydrogen bonds with it. Okay, so to draw this out a little bit more, okay, if you have the sodium, so say you start with sodium chloride, right? And then you're going to add it to water. What's going to happen is it's going to break apart into sodium ions and chlorine ions. Okay, and then the water molecule will then make hydrogen bonds with it. Okay, so for the sodium, it's positively charged, so that's going to attract the negative end of the water molecules. Right? Remember, this has a partial negative, and make hydrogen bonds with it. And it's just going to do that all the way around that sodium. Okay, it kind of makes a bubble of water around it, and that's called a hydration shell. The chlorine is the opposite, so it has a negative charge, so it's going to attract the hydrogen end of water with its partial positive. I know my handwriting is really terrible with this thing that I have to write on. At any rate, that causes it to dissolve. Okay, and you see that same process with anything that water can make hydrogen bonds with. And this brings us to some terms that you need to know. One is hydrophilic and the other is hydrophobic. So you need to know what these mean and have a good working definition of them. So hydrophilic are substances that can make hydrogen bonds with water, okay? And of course those substances can then also be dissolved in water. Okay, what kind of things can make hydrogen bonds with water? Polar molecules, which are molecules that have many polar bonds, and then also ionic substances, right? So we've just talked about that at length. Hydrophobic's the opposite. Oh, I was going to tell you. So hydro means water and philic means to like. Hydrophobic, phobic means to fear. Okay, so it's the opposite of to like, and hydro still means water. So hydrophobic molecules are water fearing, Okay, these are substances that can't make hydrogen bonds with water. If they can't make hydrogen bonds with water, then they can't be dissolved in water, right? Because that's how something becomes dissolved, is to make hydrogen bonds with it. And these are nonpolar molecules, or molecules that have many nonpolar bonds. We will see as we go through some more complex molecules, we'll see some nonpolar molecules that do have a couple polar bonds in them, but are primarily nonpolar. Okay. All right, so that's our second characteristic. So on to our third. It's this ability of water to moderate temperatures. Okay, and that's because the water is hydrogen bonded together. So for example, water takes longer to heat up than does land, and that's because in order to heat something up, heat is really just making molecules move more quickly. Excuse me. In order to make the water molecules move quickly, you first have to undo those hydrogen bonds. But those darn hydrogen bonds keep forming over and over again, which means that the sun's energy, or the heat source, just keeps kind of getting absorbed and dissipated, and then it leaves. So it takes a large amount of energy to get water temperature to rise, larger than things that don't make hydrogen bonds. Okay, and then oppositely, it also takes water longer to cool than other substances. And then finally, the last thing is that water is less dense when solid. So solid water is ice. So in case you don't remember this, things can have three different states. They can be a gas, a liquid, or a solid. Okay, and they can go back and forth between these. Right. So liquid would what would be called water, I guess. Solid is ice, and gas is vapor. Okay, when you boil something, you're going from liquid to vapor. Okay, that's evaporation. And when you're going from water to ice, you're freezing it. Okay, so the cool thing about water is it actually gets less dense when you freeze it, when it becomes a solid, and this is actually the opposite of what most substances do. Most substances become more dense or take up less space as they become solid. But water does it differently, and that's all because of the hydrogen bonds. So in liquid water, every water molecule is bonded to other hydrogen bonds, yet these water molecules are all moving around. Okay, liquid water is, at a temperature where the water molecules can vibrate around and move a lot. That means they form a hydrogen bond with somebody, and then as those molecules move, they move apart from each other and they form hydrogen bonds with somebody else. Okay, a good analogy for this maybe would be a room full of people who are all walking around, holding hands with people, but as they walk around, they lose grip and then hold hands with somebody else. Okay, so that's liquid water. So there's not a distinct, like a uniform distance between water molecules. As the water cools, the molecules move more slowly. So when you cool something down, that means you're making the molecules move more slowly. The hydrogen bonds become regularly spaced and stabilized. And it actually holds water so that the water molecules are farther apart from each other on average than they are in liquid water. Okay, and so this forms a water crystal, and it also takes up more space, right? So because they're stabilized, you can fit fewer water molecules in the same area, and then also it forms these little spots in the middle that trap air. Okay, and so water also acts as an insulator. It is less heavy when it is solid ice than when it is liquid, and that means that ice floats on top of water, and it actually keeps the water below it warmer than the surrounding temperature. Of course, that's all relative because it's really cold. This is really important for organisms that live in the water, which many organisms do because the earth is mostly water. So here's this seal here, for example. In the winter, he spends most of his time in the water because it's warmer than the air. He only comes up to breathe. Okay, and this ice is floating on top of the water, which is good because if ice were more dense than water, then as it formed, it would sink to the bottom and build up from the bottom, and pretty soon an entire ocean or entire lake would be frozen, and then it would only start thawing from the top down, and that would make it so that organisms could not live under there during the winter. Okay, finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about, we're not going to talk about this too much, is pH. Okay, so water, actually, when you have water, H2O, it ionizes back and forth between being, so it kind of goes both ways, from being H plus OH minus. Okay, so it actually ionizes, and then so that gives us a number of hydrogen ions and OH ions. So OH, that's an OH group. Okay, and that gives us pH. So at pH, pHs could be from 0 up to 14. Okay, things that are on this side of 7 are considered to be acidic, and things that are on this side of 7, the other side of 7, are basic. Okay, and then pH 7 itself is neutral. Okay, when something is acidic, it has more hydrogen ions, and when something is basic, it has fewer hydrogen ions. Okay, we'll talk about pH a little bit in relation to protein structure, so we can hit on that again when we come back to that.